Welcome, everyone. I'm Milo Phillips Brown. I'm an associate professor of philosophy here at Oxford and a member of the Institute for Ethics and AI. I'm also a research fellow in digital ethics and governance at the Jane Family Institute. And I'm delighted to welcome you today to a joint colloquium from Oxford's Institute for Ethics and AI and the Oxford Character Project. So today we're going to be investigating the question, can we be good people online? So we'll explore whether it's possible to develop and exercise democratic virtues in the digital world. So the basic idea is that we'll have a panel with 3 speakers who you'll be introduced to in just a minute. Each speaker will talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open things up to a Q&A with you, everyone on YouTube. So at any point during the talk or the panel or the Q&A itself, just drop a question into the chat, and we'll draw on those when asking the speakers. So let me now introduce to you our moderator for this evening, Dr. Laney Watson. So Dr. Watson is a philosopher project. So before she came to Oxford, she spent 10 years at the University of Edinburgh, where, as you'll soon see, is where our panelists are from. So at the Oxford Character Project, Laney now leads a research stream, along with our other event organizer, Matthew Kwan Johnson, on character and responsible innovation in the tech sector. So they approach this topic from both a theoretical and practical dimensions. And so Dr. Watson's own research in particular concerns intellectual character, with a special eye to the skills and virtues surrounding good questioning. So very much looking forward to the panel, and let's turn things over now to Dr. Watson.
Thank you so much, Milo, and thank you everyone for being here this evening, panelists and audience alike. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists this evening, Dr. Oliver Escobar, Dr. Eva Luger, and Professor Shannon Vallor. So just to give you a little introduction into each of our panelists this evening. Dr. Escobar is Senior Lecturer in Public Policy at the University of Edinburgh, and he's the academic lead on democratic innovation at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, the EFI. And Dr. Escobar works on participatory and deliberative democracy with a focus on political inequalities and the governance of the future. He combines research and practice to develop social and democratic innovations across policy and community contexts. And Dr. Escobar's work has been shared in 50 publications, 40 training courses for students and professionals across the public sector and civil society. And before academia, Dr. Escobar worked in literature, radio, retail, fishing, and construction, a real medley. Dr. Luger is Chancellor's Fellow in Digital Arts and Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. She's a Fellow of the Alan Turing Institute and Acting Director of Research at Edinburgh Futures Institute. She's a co-investigator on a number of exciting projects, all of which explore the relationship between humans and data. And she's also a principal investigator for ICE AI, a project exploring the use of algorithmic intelligibility and use within public service, media, and journalism. Dr. Luger has worked as a researcher in academia, industry, and the third sector, and her work investigates socio-technical and ethical issues arising from machine intelligence and data-driven systems. And finally, Professor Shannon Vallor is the Baillie Gifford Chair in Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence and is the Director of the Centre for Techno-Moral Futures at the Edinburgh Futures Institute. She's also appointed as a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. And Professor Vallor's research explores how emerging technologies reshape human, moral, and intellectual character, and maps the ethical challenges and opportunities posed by new uses of data and artificial intelligence. Her work includes advising academia, government, and industry on the ethical design and use of AI, and she's a former visiting researcher and AI ethicist at Google. She's the author of Technology and the Virtues, a philosophical guide to a future worth wanting, and editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Philosophy of Technology. She's the recipient of multiple awards for teaching, scholarship, and public engagement, including the 2015 World Technology Award in Ethics. And just a little more about the relatively new Centre for Techno-Moral Futures at EFI, which Professor Vallor directs. The centre is founded on the insight that sustainable futures for the human family require the unification of technological expertise and moral wisdom, domains of knowledge and understanding that have for much of human history been kept apart or even opposed to one another to society's detriment. So this academic year, the centre has launched with a 10-year research programme funding up to 18 PhD studentships in the ethics of data and AI, to be followed by the launch in 2023 of a new MSc in data ethics, as well as public engagement initiatives aiming to foster civic participation in shaping the values that drive technological innovation. So as you can no doubt tell from these introductions, our panelists this evening have a real wealth of experience and expertise to draw on from across academia, public policy, and industry to help us explore some of the very, very complex questions facing modern society at the intersection of technology and ethics. So without further ado, let's get to that, and I'll open up to our panel, who will each speak for around 10 minutes before we open up to the Q&A with you, the audience. We're going to run this in the reverse order that I just introduced. So we'll hear from Professor Vallor, and then Dr. Luger, and then Dr. Escobar, and then we'll have time for the Q&A. So I hope you're looking forward to this as much as I am. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thanks very much to Milo and to Lonnie for inviting Oliver and Eva and myself here. I hope this is just the first of many future collaborations between EFI and the University of Edinburgh and the Oxford Institute for Ethics in AI and the Oxford Character Project. We have a lot of common interests and common aims, and it's just great to be here as part of your conversation. So I'm going to start out by sharing my slides, which, as you can see from the title, my opening discussion is going to change the terms of the conversation a little bit from the question of can we be good people online to can we be good publics online? Because people is a broad term that can refer to individuals and asking the question of whether as individuals we can be good online. But there's also an important set of questions around the extent to which as people we are also members of publics. And how we act as publics is something that I think is woefully understudied in the online context. And particularly with respect to the kinds of moral capabilities and moral and intellectual virtues that are necessary for publics to be good online. So let's go ahead and get started. So just for those of you present who aren't familiar, I'll try to just go through this relatively quickly. But just to sort of refresh everyone on some fundamental aspects of virtue theory, as an ethical theory, virtue theory has traditionally focused on the virtues of individuals. We talk about virtues as individual traits, like honesty or courage that embody personal excellence. We talk about how these are modeled by moral exemplars in the community. Again, these are individual persons seen as exemplars of virtue or excellence. They're cultivated typically by the habits of the individual that embed virtue in their character. And again, character is taken to be a possession of an individual person. The virtues are then thought to be expressed consistently and intelligently by the virtuous person. in a manner that is perfected by practical wisdom, or what Aristotle called phronesis, and in a way that promotes the flourishing of that individual agent over a lifespan. So I think we also know that when we talk about virtue, we can't separate it from the social and political sphere, because individuals flourish, and this is something that Aristotle understood, that Confucius understood, that most virtue theorists have understood. Individuals flourish by cultivating and expressing virtue in specific social roles, and in particular political contexts. So Aristotle says in Book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics, the best man is not he who exercises his virtue toward himself, but he who exercises it toward another, for this is a difficult task. Justice in this sense then is not part of virtue, but virtue entire. And here the political virtue of justice remains a trait of persons, however. So it's persons that express virtue in the political domain. And so when we think about the virtues as civic virtues of integrity, honesty, loyalty, civility, open-mindedness, tolerance, cooperativeness, again, we're often framing these as the civic virtues that are possessed by individuals and embedded in individual character. And that's all fine and good. But what I'm trying to argue is that there's something missing here. So we're going to get close to it by talking about democratic virtues, but then I'm going to make one more leap forward to try to get us to the destination. So democratic virtues are usually thought to be those civic virtues that are most essential to flourishing as an excellent member of a democratic polity. So we talk about virtues of civility, reasonableness, and tolerance as more readily identified as democratic virtues than, say, a virtue like loyalty, which might not be insignificant in a democratic context, but would certainly, for example, be more important in non-democratic polities or authoritarian polities. But flourishing democracies require joint excellence in political activity. You can't have a flourishing democracy just by having an uncoordinated array of individually prudent and wise decisions. So we need a theory of the virtues of democratic publics. And so my question is, how do publics become consistently just and wise? Not individual members of publics, but publics themselves, because publics themselves have to coordinate and act in flourishing democracies. So this gets us to a concept of public virtues. Those are embodied in the joint exercise of political morality and intelligence. Just as individual civic virtues characterize the consistent moral excellence of the individual agent over a lifetime, we can think of public virtues as characterizing the moral excellence of a democratic polity over an extended time horizon. They're essential to the ability of democratic publics to address challenges that require long-term planning and coordinated execution of wise strategies. So if we think about climate change, pandemics, AI automation and its impact on labor, and global inequality, these are all examples of looming crises or present crises that cannot be managed wisely or well by individuals. They have to be managed by virtuous publics that have sort of coordinated democratic capabilities and excellence. So what we're talking about then is a type of collective virtue. And there's interesting work by Miranda Fricker on the collective virtue of institutions. But beyond this, there hasn't been much study of the nature of collective virtue. So this is something that a lot more work still needs to be done on. When we talk about collective virtues, we're assuming that these rest on group-dependent properties rather than just the summative properties of virtuous individuals. As I said before, a democratic public would not be virtuous simply by having many virtues among its members. That there would have to be some virtue-relevant properties that were dependent on the group. And that means that these virtues would be multiply realizable, meaning they could be instantiated in the group by different configurations of individuals. It wouldn't have to be the same individuals manifesting these at every moment. It means that beliefs, desires, attitudes, and dispositions that are virtuous attach to the group, but not always to every individual within it. And it entails the promotion of excellence of the collective in achieving its proper ends over an extended period of time. So this presupposes that democratic publics have their own ends, not merely the ends or purposes of the individual members. And this then entails analogs of individual virtues like justice and courage. So in addition to having just members, the group itself could be said to be just under certain conditions. But there might also be distinctively collective virtues. Byerly and Byerly have argued, for example, that solidarity might be a distinctively collective virtue of certain groups or institutions that cannot be understood on the level of the individual. So a question I'd like to ask and pose for the discussion is, how are the virtues of publics cultivated? What are the environmental conditions that enable public virtue to emerge? I use a lot the parable of Ox Mountain from Mencius or Menze on the fact that virtues require environmental support. Certain conditions have to be met in order for virtue to be stable. And so what forms of shared education and culture are effective in promoting and sustaining public virtue? Because more so than individual virtues, a public's virtues are going to depend heavily on its political medium for communication and coordinated thought and action. And unfortunately, we have today a political medium that's increasingly, perhaps almost entirely, constituted in digital environments that were not designed for public excellence. So I want to be able to open the conversation about what it would take to have digital environments that were suitable to the cultivation of virtuous publics. We know that we need to reject the naive view that democratic health needs only an efficiently networked communication structure. We know that greater information availability doesn't reliably enable collective knowledge or practical wisdom. That's why conspiracy theories and misinformation can spread even more rapidly, even as there is a greater net pool of information available. We have current digital media platforms that deliver rewards and incentives at the individual level only, so likes, retweets, etc. And many digital incentives run counter to public virtues of solidarity, cooperativeness, tolerance, and deliberateness. And we have to remember that online debate is not the same thing as online deliberation. And a democracy has to be excellent in online deliberation if it's to flourish online. Debate is something where you have individual positions or options that are going head to head, and one can win. But online deliberation requires action be taken by the group as a whole. And this is something we do not know how to cultivate well in online settings. So in conclusion then, I have two premises. First, that democratic publics currently exist in the digital equivalent of Ox Mountain. For those not familiar with the parable, it means a place that is barren and unsupportive, does not nurture the cultivation and expression of virtue that needs to be there. And premise two, that this constitutes a barrier to democratic flourishing and very possibly to long-term human survival. So the implications of this: we need digital platform design that enables the virtues of democratic publics rather than merely citizens. We need a better empirical understanding of the digital environmental conditions that enable public virtues. We need to know what motivates public excellence as a shared and jointly constructed achievement. And that means we need a new theory and practice of digital public virtues. Thank you. And now I think we're turning over to Eva.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm just opening my slides. Oh, am I opening my slides? Am I sharing? Okay.
Yep, we can see them.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, yeah, so I again, as all good academics do, decided to interpret the question the way that suited me best. So I think it's an interesting question, and can we be good people online? The question seems to point us towards asking about our capacity to be good. But for the purposes of this session, and because my background is predominantly human-computer interaction, I'm going to take the position that our capacity and our agency is limited by design. So the question for me becomes, does the system allow us to be good? The internet's a heavily curated and designed space, and it's one that's based upon a particular view of us. So it's individualized rather than collective, speaking to Shannon's points, and it highlights notions of individual autonomy and human agency, and it assumes that we're rational actors in the economic neoliberal sense. You know, we are goal-seeking and looking to minimize benefit for ourselves as individuals, at least cost. It's also not a static playing field. The world imagined by tech giants and the research community that I'm part of essentially reduces our direct interactions with technology as we move to different forms of interaction. It more heavily curates our experiences, so it's sort of managed and created through the systems that we interact. It predicts our needs and behaviours and acts on the basis of those predictions. And it's also designed by one of the least diverse communities imaginable. Add to that the idea that everything that seems free on the internet is actually powered by a model of monetization, and the endless drive towards novelty and innovation, the joke that we're all looking for the moonshot is actually true. That's precisely what they talk about within technology companies. And you're getting the broad idea of the kind of climate within which we're trying to design democratic spaces. So I'm also making the assumption that we're talking primarily about our visible behaviour here. But in reality, nobody's really interested in our visible behaviour. The money is in what we secretly and quietly do in the background that we don't want anybody to see. That's where we are best sort of discovered, I suppose, or understood by the systems that we interact with. And that's produced through our consumption practices. And the key words of our online life are personalisation, convenience, immediacy. And we've been trained to sacrifice a certain amount of agency in a kind of implicit value trade-off. And I use that particular slide indicating one way because that's how design is pushing you. It's like, oh, you can choose from all of these things, but they all take you in this one direction. So the question is, you know, can we be good? I'm not sure, but I think it's useful to know a little bit more about the characteristics of the systems we interact with. And the more we dig into this, the more it problematizes these ideas. So these systems are algorithmic and data-driven. That means that they rely on huge amounts of training data, and the flows of those data and the types of those data and the relationships between them are invisible to us. Like, we're not intended to see them, and so we don't get the opportunity to challenge or revoke any of the decisions. The interfaces and our interactions with them are designed to decouple users from devices. There was a lovely ethnographic paper by Peter Tommy that talked about tools being invisible in use. It's not a new idea, but for technology, it's certainly an idea that is interesting when you think about it closely. So these instruments are intended to just free us up to do other things. We're not supposed to think about our interactions or what we do with these devices. It's not a reflective activity. And they're seamless. We don't see the sort of the operation under the hood. And they combine, infer, and predict and act on the basis of our data. And we, as users, have no mental model for this. So that's the cognitive map by which we sort of understand a system, technological or otherwise. And they're seamless, and they're designed to minimally distract us from our task at hand. We're not supposed to stop and pause and think. That's not really how they're designed. And they're reductionist. So we design for aesthetic minimalism. There are a series of very small controls that are intended to allow you to, like me just now, sharing the screen. I had one button to press and I still managed to mess it up slightly. So you can see really why designers push us towards this kind of aesthetic minimalism, but it does reduce the design space if you're wanting to create something that's more reflective. And it's all about preference and satisfaction. That's literally the core driver between most of the platforms that we interact on socially and in community ways. And what we say is rarely what we do. And this is where they have us, the people that design these systems, because the behavior intention gap is vast. You know, we say we're good, we want to do good things, but when nobody's looking, that's not really what we do. And unfortunately, if we do it online, then we're not the only people that know that. I really like this quote by Martin Moore because I think this sort of sums it up. I enjoyed the book very much, Democracy Act. But the idea that, there's a sacrifice to be made. Effectively, you're losing a bit of privacy, you're losing a bit of freedom, you're losing a bit of agency. Such a throwaway notion. Those are really big ideas and really powerful things, and we're just kind of discarding them because we want to get to our end goals within these systems. And values are everywhere. We don't talk about technology being neutral anymore. In fact, somebody would probably slap you actively if you said that. It's an idea that's very, very dated. But I think we sometimes forget how value-laden the systems are. The content is created, and those values are based on our behaviours. And these are behaviours I was talking about, these implicit, secret behaviours. These, when we look a little bit too long at our past partner's Facebook, or we follow the ads for things that we don't really want other people to know that we're interested in, or we read horoscopes, or whatever else you're embarrassed of doing. This is all tracked. And Facebook ranks content in relation, it's a relational content ranking thing, in relation to what you've done, who you're connected to, what you're interested in. And I've just listed there the signals that Facebook decides upon its content ranking in relation to. So, the last of them there, the relevancy score, that's really very similar to what we would have described as news values or media values in the past. So it's not massively different from what we might have seen, but it's using very different types of information. And it's not information we're necessarily voluntarily giving up. And also this platform is highly ideological. The values are not just encoded in the practice, they're also writ large. It's about freedom of speech. The people that own these large platforms and corporations are all about making things open and free, and we should be able to say what we need to say. But there's sometimes conflict. So for example, the idea of misinformation being bad. Well, you can say some things, but not all things, and we're going to decide what things you can't say. So there's constantly trade-offs being made here. One really good example actually is anti-vaxxers. So Facebook made a stand that what they wanted to do was to reduce the posts around anti-vaxxing, that was misinformation. But the problem they had was that this required them the algorithm to be sufficiently sophisticated that would pick out all of these stories. But in reality, this is a bit of a blanket solution. So not only did it de-amplify in your newsfeed the stuff that was misinformation, but it would also capture with it all the things about different ways of managing your health or healing or thinking about well-being that were also considered to be misinformation. I suppose I want to use this example to show that these systems are at scale. So we might have ideas about how we do this in a very localized way, but the question is, if we're talking about online good behavior, does it scale? And there's a limited space for reflection. So I talked about minimal distraction, but there's also the issue of low latency. We don't like any kind of slow interactions specifically. Some things are designed to be slow, but they are identified as that, like mindfulness apps and such like. But generally speaking, in our daily interactions, we are intolerant of any latency. We get incredibly frustrated when a web page takes ages when I say ages, 5 seconds to load. We don't like that. So there aren't really any spaces to stop and think in between all of the clicks. So where is the space for new values? I think this is the question that we have to ask. Where can we build these in, and how do we influence these more meta values that are sitting above the platforms that are designed for us to interact on? And the issue of scalability, as I've said, how do we apply these in a global way? And the final point I want to make on this slide particularly is about privacy wars. I've called it that, but really this is just about, the idea that on one side we talk about wanting to protect our privacy, and on the other side we have a series of behaviours that constantly undermine it. We say one thing, we do another, and the issue really is that if you want to engage, publicly in a meaningful way in a a democratic space, you have to have a fully robust private sphere, and we don't have that currently in online spaces. And so I'm going to move finally to dark patterns. So dark patterns are the kind of it sounds incredibly scary and freaky. It's actually not really. They're just the kind of behavioural tools that we use as designers to nudge people towards certain practices online. Actually, I'm not sure that made it any less scary or freaky sounding, but this quote, I think, quite nicely encapsulates it. It leads us towards making decisions we might not otherwise make. So that's quite a powerful statement to make. And there are lots of different ways that we do this, and this is just an example of them. There are nudges, like this. Nudges are not a really new idea. They're from the 1970s, and underpinned most of the way we thought about marketing. For example, architects would build shopping malls that were intended to confuse people, so they would go in, they'd see a brand or their favorite shop and they'd go into it. We've been pushing people towards behaviors through architecture, through design of various different types of tools, through affordances, and through different types of practices for years and years. But this was brought into the public sphere by sort of Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler when they talked about how you could apply nudges to policy. And if you remember this, during the sort of the Labour years where policy nudges were a really big thing. And if we want to see how this works in systems, think about opt-out consent. So if you agree to sharing your data with somebody, you say, I probably wouldn't share that data with this third party who I don't know. If I automatically opt you in, the likelihood of you opting out is incredibly low. If I opt you out automatically, the likelihood of you opting in is incredibly low as well. So the way that you frame the question in terms of design massively affects the outcome as well. There's also growth hacking. So this is where we basically stimulate spread either through sort of viral engagement or through different types of mechanisms like fake reviews and clickbait and such like, where you're trying to get your product out broadly. There are also applications that are sticky by design. Games, you might think about, if you remember Flappy Birds, the worst game in the world, but it was so addictive and you kept going back to it because you got that mad endorphin hit. These things have addictive qualities like drugs, and they are designed to specifically keep bringing you back and make you spend more time on a platform. And there's also the timers and the countdown clocks and all the rest of it. And we are training users effectively. So the sum outcome, I said, is a citizenry trained to respond to specific cues, which is, we're like Pavlov's animals. So I'm going to just end in a really unsatisfying way by basically saying, can we be good people online? I suppose, my answer to that question is maybe, but we have to be aware of the vast infrastructure of influence within which we're asking this quite political question. So thank you very much for listening. And I will now hand over to Oliver.
Great, thanks, Eva. I'm just going to share my slides. Let me say, it's just great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to come along and present. Hopefully you can see my slides okay, but let me know otherwise. So I suppose my presentation follows quite well from the work of Shannon and Eva. What I try to do is to look at the types of democratic spaces and spaces in the public sphere in which people are building their digital lives and the kind of citizens that people are becoming online. So I'm going to offer a few ideas and things to think with, and hopefully we can return to some of these issues in more depth in the discussion. So I'm going to go a little bit fast. But I'll start with answering the question straight away, just by saying that I do think we can, and we indeed are good people online under the right conditions, which I think is a common theme across the three presentations today. I start from classic democratic theory, contemporary democratic theory, Tocqueville, that notion that it's not that good people make good societies make good people. I would apply something similar to the relationship between people and digital worlds. But we must place this conversation in the context of the global democratic recession, because our digital public sphere, it's a reflection of the kind of situation that has been building up in democracies all over the world, particularly in the last 10 years, but in some of these trends are decades old. So what do we mean by the democratic recession? There are a number of indicators, and once you put them together, you can begin to see that there are some reasonable grounds to believe that democracies around the world are in trouble. We have lost quite a few democratic systems. There has been an acceleration in that loss. The surging autocracies, the losses of basic human rights and kind of rule of law, basic foundations for democracy in many places. And then we have attitudes and how we begin to note across the world some unrest, particularly amongst some of the youngest populations, which sometimes leads to authoritarian attitudes being on the rise. So the UK, where we are, was just before the pandemic at the highest ever recorded level for democratic dissatisfaction since these things have been recorded. I suspect some of the studies that will follow will tell us where we are just now, but there is a pattern that Dalton notices globally, and this is this growing gap between the politically rich, those who know how to use existing spaces and systems to their advantage, and the politically poor, those who are often systematically excluded from political influence and shaping the decisions that affect their lives. And much of this boils down to this notion that people love democracy, people tend to love democratic principles, but are highly dissatisfied at how it is practiced. Now, there is a brighter side to this, because of course, all these trends and tensions translate into particular dynamics in the way the digital public sphere is emerging, evolving, and developing. And there is a brighter side, which is in political science, there's this field called the field of democratic innovation, which tries to map out other types of spaces where citizens are involved in democratic governance through participation, deliberation, and influence. And there are many different examples. I don't have the time to get into the details. Some of them will be familiar to people here, but their role in the digital public sphere is potentially quite exciting. Some of the examples that have become more prominent in recent times are some of the online deliberative mini-publics, the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland, the Climate Assembly dealing with issues of environmental governance and climate crisis, was fully digital and developed quite a unique space for online deliberation. There are many other examples. Participatory budgeting, which is a really interesting process that has evolved over the last 30 years and has spread all across the world. Madrid, for example, had a very powerful digital participatory budgeting process with up to 100 million invested annually. So these things have been proliferating, in the case of Madrid involving hundreds of thousands of citizens. And then most recently, the case of Taiwan has become quite prominent because it played the digital infrastructure and civic technology developed since the Sunflower movement have now reshaped the way governance systems are being developed, and was one of the factors that helps us to understand how Taiwan managed the pandemic. So a lot of promising spaces and a lot of spaces where citizens are being good people online. It's just that these spaces often fall off the radar of how we tell the story of democracy. And the final part of my presentation, I want to zoom in and go a little bit more to the micropolitics and the fabric of democratic life, which for me comes down to communication. And it's not just, of course, this is nothing new. There's a long tradition of work in deliberative democracy and in the field of democratic innovations, where we're trying to bring back the importance of communication as being consequential and not just instrumental, not just a matter of transmitting messages, not just what gets done, but what gets made along the way, what kind of contexts, what kind of relationships, and what are the building blocks, how these things get made. And that takes us to the space of common rituals in the public sphere, a lot of the kind of dynamics that end up shaping public conversations. I don't have the time to get into the detail of these dynamics, but the one thing to know about communication patterns, and is well documented in communication studies, is that they tend to reproduce themselves. So the more these patterns happen, the more the spaces in which they happen entrench those patterns, and the more the digital public sphere takes a particular shape. And that goes back to the point that Shannon was making earlier. Because there are choices in the kind of communication patterns that we seek to enable, support, foster. Debate is very useful in certain scenarios where winning and losing is an acceptable dichotomy, where you can engage in more kind of ritual argumentative exchanges, but sometimes you need dialogue, which is more focused on exploration and understanding, on building relationships, and sometimes you need deliberation, which is crucial in decision making. And informed, considered judgment where you're coming to the end of a process that seeks to produce a recommendation or a decision. The problem is that our public sphere has been overly dominated by debate, and we've forgotten all these fundamental practices of democratic life, but they are going to be crucial in any attempt we do at democratic repair. I'm almost concluding, coming to my final slide, but this is just to illustrate the power of communication patterns that go beyond the usual ritualistic debate where you just engage at the level of positions. Once you manage to foster spaces that create the incentives and the architecture of incentives and practices of dialogue and deliberation, you can go beyond that visibility line of positional argumentation, and you can begin to reach deeper levels of conversation around interests, values, needs, and fears. So where does this leave us? So this has been a super quick tour of fields that are really vast. So I'm keen to come back to these issues, but just some thoughts as I close. We live, as Sel and Erkan and others have noted, in a time of communicative plenty, which means that there is a lot of noise, amplification of good stuff and bad stuff all over the place. But in the end, the digital public sphere is what it is because our non-digital public sphere is what it is. And we need to watch out for the multiplication of digital spaces. What kind of spaces are being multiplied and augmented? Is there a space for dialogue, deliberation, and debate, or are these things being skewed towards one type of public engagement? And this is really important because that's the difference between public reasoning and public opinion. And arguably, we need more of the former. For me, in the end, it boils down to this question: what kind of citizen are citizens invited to be? Spectators, bystanders, complainers, or co-producers, thinkers, problem solvers? And we can come back to this notion because, there is no such thing as the public. Publics need to be assembled, summoned, brought into being, and therefore the kind of processes and systems that support that matter greatly. And that goes to the point that Eva made earlier. Is the difference between developing more and more collectives or developing more and more herds? That's the difference between a participatory democracy based on critical citizenship or forms of authoritarian populism that are much more about creating a dynamic of leaders and followers, hence the herd metaphor. But of course, we shouldn't forget there are structuring forces. Shannon has mentioned some of them: political economies based on regimes of inequality, our media ecosystem, and perhaps the great work that needs to be done in the next 10 years is to undo what I'm calling here one of the most consequential assaults on the public imagination in the last century, which sounds a little bit grand, but I genuinely believe in this claim, which is that we have been made to believe that democracy is just about electoral contexts and party politics. Now, the field of democratic innovation shows that there is more to it, that you can have a political and a democratic life that goes beyond some of these classic instruments. So we need to build and rebuild and reimagine. And I'm going to leave it there, thanking you all and recommending Participia, the Wikipedia for participatory nerds, which is a crowdsourced space for inspiration and cases and so on. I highly recommend it. And add your cases as well if you're working on specific processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that rich, very, very dense and interesting set of ideas. I feel like there's so much ground has been covered in those three short presentations. And I know we've got loads of questions that people will be typing into the chat just now, and we've got some to kickstart us off. So I'm just going to start with this question to any of you. The questioner asks, what might a new kind of digital platform that enables productive online deliberation or fosters the exercise of democratic virtues look like?
Someone went right for the hard problem, didn't they? Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I think Oliver's presentation in its closing touched upon is that many of us have had our imaginations, our political imaginations and moral imaginations curtailed and constrained to such a great degree that it seems daunting or even impossible to envision platforms that serve a different political purpose than the ones that we know. But I do think that we can at least work backwards, if you will, from some of the basic democratic capabilities that the three of us have touched on. Just as, I mean, this is what designers do, right? They say, here's what we need to enable as a functionality or as an action or as an outcome, and what do we build in order to get there. And so I think we need to start by thinking about what are the capabilities of publics that we want those platforms to enable. And certainly deliberation and dialogue, as Oliver mentioned, are key here. I also think another capability is the ability to imagine different kinds of shared futures. What we don't do online a lot is talk about how we might live together in different ways. We talk about the things we want for ourselves or the things we're afraid of for ourselves, the ways that we don't want to be hurt by particular economic or political arrangements. But we often don't talk about visions of shared human flourishing beyond a very sort of vague hand-waving kind of way. So I think those are three capabilities that if I were designing the next version of a social platform, I would be focusing on designing for deliberation. And that means representing those shared problems and maybe forcing, if you will, a process where the process needs to lead towards an action, a decision that receives a certain amount of support, where the action can't go forward unless there's a certain degree of consensus or agreement. And working with very small scale, even initially low stakes examples of that might help people train up those capabilities in online settings a little bit more. But I also think the sort of narratives, the kind of imagining practice, the political imagination, strengthening that muscle is another thing I would focus on.
Thanks.
I wonder if
Yeah, please.
If I may add a bit, just building on that, and there's always a risk in highlighting specific examples, because then people go looking at them, looking for perfection, which is not a standard we apply to where we currently exist. So it's always going to be an unfair comparison. But I am going to offer some examples of people who are really, really trying to create interesting platforms. So for example, in Barcelona, they developed this platform called Decidim. I can spell it out in the chat in YouTube in a second. And Decidim is a platform that accommodates all kinds of participatory and deliberative processes, and is being used by all kinds of organizations, from social movements to institutions, governments, agencies. And the latest is that they developed the Backstage online platform for the Conference of Europe. So these things are beginning to emerge. Decidim is not perfect, but is a really good example of these new capabilities for different kind of spaces. And then in Taiwan, as I mentioned earlier, there's this a tech company called Polis, which uses artificial intelligence as a way of enabling large scale public deliberation. There are questions around it and interesting things to improve, but there's no doubt that it's going to be one of the trailblazers in this space. Now, what Taiwan is trying to do, and this is the bit that where it gets tricky, is that on the one hand, you have participatory platforms, crowdsourcing platforms, deliberative platforms, and on the other, you have social networks. And cracking the union of those two, creating a social network that is at its heart participatory and deliberative, then that's the next frontier. And I think some of the learning for the last 5-10 years is going to be crucial.
Thanks, Oliver. Eva, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this in a very pragmatic way. So I'm going to dumb it down. No, so one of the things that occurs to me with lots of these projects, I'm thinking specifically about programs in the UK, is that the question of who funds it becomes really important in terms of then how that platform or that system is influenced and its direction of travel. And so, you know, if you're funded by a sort of a, say, research council or what you might consider a more neutral source, then that's fine. But then we have issues of sustainability. So there's quite a lot of projects that have seen amazing when they become at a point of inception, but in reality they don't scale and they're not sustainable. And you also need somebody for whom it's a passion project to keep this thing going, because even where, for example, in my past life, but also in my academic life, working with voluntary and community organisations you have to keep that relationship going and sustaining it. You need to provide technical support, operational support, design support. Quite often it's really tempting to bolt this on existing systems and technical solutions, but then you draw with it all of the historical problems and baggage that I've described during my talk. So I think you know, what a platform might look like, it has to look probably very different from the kinds of things we're used to using, and that in itself is a problem, because that's maybe not what we want, but it's what we've been trained to want. So you show somebody something a little different and they're going to be skeptical. And we are rubbish, I think Shannon mentioned this, at predicting the future. I mean, colossally bad. You know, even when you do futuring workshops with people, they imagine this future, and 3 years on, you look back and sort of shelve that research in embarrassment because none of it came to pass. And one classic example was I did some user research with people about whether they would be willing to just talk to their phone without their phone being visible as they walk down the street. Universally, no. All of the workshops know this. We would look like we were mad, you know, and then 4 years on, it's a common practice. People are terrible at predicting these things. So I would say with those caveats, potentially a platform is possible, but I think that it's an uphill struggle to make it scalable and independent.
Can I just add one last thing to that that has been bothering me as well, which is that as Eva says, you need the energy to be sustainable. And one of the problems that we have right now is a lot of the energy that we could put into democratic participation is being drained off by social platforms, which have a very different function, right? So if, as Eva says, you have been trained to want to be on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, that's also using up a certain amount of energy for communication and exchange and response that would otherwise be available for more democratic endeavors. So on top of an economic order that seems determined to keep everybody exhausted all the time, with perhaps the idea that, you know, people who are sufficiently exhausted don't try to change things or organize or protest. But nevertheless, you combine that with the fact that people's leisure energy is being drained off by these other kinds of modes of engagement. And I think it's not just if you build it, they will come, right? Build the right democratic platform and then people will flood to it and stay there. They won't unless some of these other structural conditions are addressed.
That's, I think, an excellent point. Okay, so a new question. This is from Obliviate14. In the age of digital giants controlling the platforms for most of our online spaces, who is responsible for deciding on what constitutes and enforcing good behavior, the individual or the platform? Great question. Difficult one.
Shall I have a stab at that quickly. I don't know if I mean, I don't have the answer. I'll start with that, but I can muse on it for a couple of moments. So responsibility, I mean, this is one of those constantly discussed points that comes up an awful lot. And I mean, platforms do take some responsibility, but they tend not to take it in advance. I think that is the point that I would make. It's like, you know, they don't sort of, they see a problem brewing and they're a bit like, oh, might be a problem, might not. And actually, you know, it's normally pushback from the peripheries and from the media and from the academic sphere in some cases that shames people really, or large platforms, into having to make change. So I think the first thing to say is that we can't leave it entirely to the platforms. That would just be madness, because their values are different. They're not the same, and we wouldn't expect them to be necessarily. We do have, you know, a certain amount of regulation in place that manages these kinds of issues. But I'm also a little bit uncomfortable about putting all of the responsibility onto the user for the reasons that I described. You know, that when we design systems, we are pushing people towards particular types of behaviors, and partly there isn't like an addiction component to it. So you know, would you give somebody that was addicted responsibility to look after like a pack of drugs? Probably not. And I think we've got to be careful about pointing the finger in one direction, saying it's all your problem or it's all your problem. I think the solution actually has to be a sort of multifaceted one that picks up all of the different, you know, plugs all the different holes in the dam. And it's complicated. I mean, it's complicated and we're not doing it very well just now, but definitely don't leave it to the tech giants, I would say.
Yeah, I'm sure Oliver has more concrete examples to draw from here, but if you think about the ways that traditional democratic environments, if we want to not call them platforms, have functioned, right? I mean, any sort of functioning system of local self-governance, you know, town halls or sort of citizen assemblies, they've always had to develop rules and constraints and norms in a process that is both supported by those who provide the environment, but negotiated and ultimately reflecting the deliberative will of the people who use that space. And you see very similar things happening on platforms like Twitter and Facebook. Twitter's, I think, a better example in the sense I think Twitter has tried to be more responsive to the demands that people make of the platform. But there's always a limit, and it's because their incentives, as Eva was saying, are not the same as the user's incentives. And so they'll give the user what users are asking for, only up to the point where it doesn't inhibit the advantages that are flowing to those who run the platform and profit from it. So you do need to think about platforms, I think, that have some public ownership, because there has to be an alignment between the incentives of the users and those who are designing and revising the environment or platform itself. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be owned by the government. When I say public, I really mean in a sort of very broad sense. But I do think we have to think about public ownership of platforms that are managed by a kind of collective will, where the deliberative process itself shapes the norms of the space.
Yeah, if I might, sorry, I know probably I shouldn't, because I know there are lots of questions, but just a note on this is that, you know, if a big chunk of our public sphere is going to be in spaces created by profit-making companies, we need to rethink all of this. And I think it's about governance. Regulation is part of that, but governance is a broader space, which includes those spaces for intersubjective kind of collective judgments on what being a good digital citizen is. So to me, I agree with Shannon. This comes to, and the platforms I mentioned earlier are either in common property, community property, or on public ownership, commons or public ownership. So that is an absolute red line for me. We have little hope of a worthwhile digital public sphere if we don't rebalance the connection between private, public, and the commons.
Thank you. So perhaps somewhat relatedly, a question from Paula Boddington. Have any of you had time to consider how the government's proposed online safety bill might impact upon democracy and virtue in the online world?
Shall I? Yeah. I mean, I've read the bill, obviously, and it is one of those things where I think, on one level, it doesn't cover enough. On another level, it's done much more than we've seen. So I'm actually pro the bill. The one thing that I would say is that it's kind of it's missing. You know, we talk about sort of protecting citizens, and what we're missing is almost the bit where citizens become more agent and are better informed. So, you know, rather than taking a paternalistic view, I think what we need to be focusing on is things like, which is currently sort of absent, security literacies, political literacies, and when I worked in the third sector for a long time for an organisation called NIACE, and we used to talk about the importance of political literacy, specifically focused on post-16 people and lifelong learners. And just the idea was, you know, very much a sort of a left-wing idea that people talked about in the abstract, but it was never really applied. It never got developed into something that was like a universal sort of set of literacies that we might be able to apply. And I think we talk about these things in the academic sphere, but it really doesn't trickle down to the people who are marginalized within our society. So, you know, if you're sort of poorer, if you are from a group that you feel less comfortable speaking up in online spaces, then you're currently not being served. And even the things we're talking about, you know, you're not being served. I've worked for years with community groups, and you tended to have 2 or 3 people that spoke for the community, but they didn't speak for the community. So even if we create these systems that are sort of perfect, and, you know, we still need to think about poverty and marginalization and voice. And I think that was absent sort of from this very operational way of looking at the citizens online.
Thanks, Eva. So the next question, this is from Hannah Nasri. She asks, is it acceptable for doctors to respond more inappropriately than they would in real life to trolls online? So they'd be representing their profession online. So I think the question is really about what democratic virtues online look like if you're engaging with trolls from a position of authority like a doctor.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of a broader set of questions about how we manage multiple identities online, and we all struggle with that, right? We all struggle with trying to be authentic selves and yet to represent organizations or professions that are larger than we are and larger than our own opinions. But when it comes to trolls specifically, the problem is that term has become so broad, as these terms always do, that it can refer to everything from someone who speaks to me in a way I don't like, and a way that sort of, you know, gets my hackles up, to someone who is threatening me and harassing me and stalking me online, and putting me in fear of harm, of whether it's physical harm or psychological harm or reputational harm. So I guess without more detail, it's hard to say, right? What is the appropriate way in which one behaves? I mean, certainly if one is a professional online, one is representing one's profession, but one is also not duty bound to hold oneself open to injury and threat, right? But then there's a separate set of questions: is what is a prudent way to deal with someone who is a threat? Often, disengaging and blocking is a better strategy than fighting fire with fire and getting into the mud with the other party. But I think I guess there's not enough information in this scenario, right, for me to say, but I think these are all things that we have to balance.
Thanks. Okay, yeah. Next question from Odd Imagine. So, and this is maybe perhaps for Shannon in particular, if this is a problem within publics or groups, what behaviors can individuals engage in or avoid engaging in to improve the situation within existing systems?
Yeah, that's a gret question. Because as much as I want to distinguish between the individual and the public, it's still the case that the public capacities are enabled by individual relationships with others. And so one of the things I think we can do is become more reflective and think of ourselves not merely as individuals, but also think of ourselves as members of publics and communities, and ask oneself, which publics am I? Because there are multiple publics. There's not a general public, right? So we are each members of multiple overlapping and intersecting publics. And being aware of that consciously, I think, can help shift our behavior patterns sometimes into one that is more cooperative or more expressive of virtues like solidarity. So if I think about the fact that what I say, for example, I'll just give you a concrete example, and it goes to the previous point also about the integrity that I have in both individual and professional or public roles. But think about the pressure that a lot of academics are under who are in positions of professional precarity, who either in the United States are considered adjuncts, untenured on sort of short-term contracts or the equivalent in the UK, of people who are underpaid, not given the sort of professional respect that their qualifications warrant, simply as a result of economic circumstances and underfunding of higher ed that's not within their control. There's a whole sort of a class of intellectual academic labor that is currently being mistreated in a systemic way. I happen to have managed to escape that tier, which I once occupied, right? But as a professional, if I don't act in solidarity with my academic colleagues, if I allow myself to make decisions and think purely according to the incentives and values and fears and desires that are relevant to my individual professional situation, then I will fail to be virtuous as a member of one of these publics that shapes my identity. So I'm just trying to give a concrete example. So if somebody's talking about the labor struggles of precarious academics, I can't allow myself to get detached from that. And even if I might make administrators uncomfortable, right, by acknowledging these realities. So these are the kinds of things that we have to think about, because when we act as individuals, we are also shaping the narratives that affect other people's lives. And so the way in which I represent the world doesn't just reflect on or affect me, it also shapes the conditions of other people's flourishing. So I think, to answer your question, I think sometimes just that critical reflective turn where we think about ourselves relationally, and think about the multiple publics to which we are responsible, can help shift the virtue expression in a different way. But that's only one piece. It's not a silver bullet.
Thanks. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. I've got an interesting one here for Eva. You mentioned dark patterns, but might dark patterns be able to be used in order to bring about the public virtues that Shannon is talking about? Or does human autonomy need to be safeguarded at every level?
Ooh, that's a thorny question. Thank you for that. Yes, well, I mean, it brings us back to the kind of the nudge stuff, doesn't it? Where actually, at some point, the UK government thought it was an excellent idea to use these patterns precisely to nudge people towards more, towards public good, towards better policy outcomes. I think when we're talking about using those patterns online, I mean, it would depend upon the context. There are probably some things you want to nudge people away from doing because they're harmful to large groups of people, or they would be offensive, or it otherwise would sort of deteriorate the climate within a system or a platform or a collective. But I think you'd have to be fairly cautious about how you use those kinds of things, and I think also be transparent. I mean, the thing we don't do at the moment is, there's not a huge amount of broad knowledge about this within society. So we've heard the terms, we understand what nudge is, but do we really know how these different actions result from our own behaviours and how we respond to them in each context? We probably don't. So I think if you are going to use those tools, then you have to equip people with the understanding to know that they're being manipulated on some level, makes them slightly less effective, or no, not that much less effective, frankly, because we still do that sort of cognitive shortcut stuff. I mean, we're hardwired. So I hope that answers the question. Like, yes, perhaps, but we have to be open and transparent about that use.
Thank you. So I think we've just got a few minutes. I'm going to ask a final kind of roundup question that you can maybe just, and this is almost impossible, but see if it's possible to give a yes or no answer. Do you think that the online world as it currently is operating skews us towards being good people online or being bad people online? Oliver, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'll use the opportunity to make one single point, which is if you're someone who looks around at the digital world and you only see a lot of the negative dynamics and tensions and a lot of the flaws and a lot of the problems, then I would say that's good. But your radar needs to be expanded. There is a brighter side. And when we don't give it a space, we are giving so much space to the darker side. And I'm beginning to put this into Manichaean terms. I don't want to do that. But there are brighter forces at play that need to enter the radars of people so that people are aware. And this connects to that crucial point about solidarity. We tend to think that people online behave in highly individualistic ways, aggregative ways. With the right spaces, in the right participatory and deliberative processes, the results speak for themselves. The Icelandic constitution, which was the first digitally crowdsourced, it was more complex than that, but constitution making process in the world, produced one of the most other-regarding constitutions ever made for people and planet. Participatory budgeting in Paris, some of the projects and initiatives in which millions have been invested through PB have been solidarity with homeless people and trying to tackle homelessness. So we're talking about, all sorts of spaces in Ireland, the issues around abortion, public health, and equal marriage. There were crucial participatory and deliberative processes that unlocked those big issues. So I want to remind people that there is this stuff happening out there. Adjust your radar, see what's going on, and contribute to that, because the public sphere is being built as we speak, and digital is not different from other sides of the public sphere.
Thank you for that ray of light. I imagine it's hard to follow that with anything, any raindrops, but Eva, Shannon, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I just, as Oliver was speaking, I had the Star Wars theme tune rocketing through my head. It's like the dark versus the light, which made me chuckle. And I think we are sometimes forced into this polarization, right, where we think that, you know, it's like there is a light and there is a dark, or there are two extremes. But in reality, most of us fall in this kind of grey moral ambiguity in the middle. Like, you know, and also we do stuff that we're uncomfortable with, that we might consider to be bad. So I guess there are thresholds. Like, what are our thresholds here? You know, I am in fact a vegetarian, but I might occasionally cook meat for somebody. Does that make me a bad person? And there's going to be probably, but there's going to be sort of grey areas in online spaces where our acceptability differs in accordance with context and you know, in accordance with sort of other like human factors. So I'd sort of say I think quite often as well, outliers are dealt with in particular types of ways. So, you know, if somebody's particularly good or says things that are particularly positive and people like them, then you tend to have that sort of quite evident, and there are spaces for that kind of thing. And if people behave incredibly badly, eventually they get theirs. Not in all cases, but, you know, in some cases. So I sort of feel as though it's not that different from everyday life, realistically. It's just, it's in our faces all the time and we're constantly connected to it. Oh.
And last thoughts, Shannon?
Yeah, I will just agree with my colleagues that I do think that for most people, their online experience is a mix of good and bad, of malicious and kind, and of people who are understanding and people who are not. And sometimes people are both on the same day, right? And I think we need to recognize all of that. But what we can focus on, as I've tried to emphasize, are what are the capabilities that I need to strengthen and exercise in order to be not just a good person, but a good citizen and a good member of publics and of the human family? And is the platform giving me those opportunities to exercise those capabilities? And do I have those opportunities as readily as I need them to be? And I think the answer to that is no, we don't have enough of that. To say that we don't have enough isn't to say that that it's all a wasteland, that it's all malicious, that it's all corrupting. There are good things that happen on my Twitter feed every day. But what we're lacking is the infrastructure that's designed to facilitate public flourishing and capabilities of the sort we've been talking about. So that's what we're looking for, is that design that has that as its a deliberate outcome, not just an accidental benefit of human goodness that lives everywhere and manifests everywhere, even in places that aren't designed for it.
Thank you so much. This has been that, I feel like that was such a nice kind of tapestry of all the kind of challenges that we face when we're thinking about and talking about and trying to act in response to these questions. We've gone a couple of minutes over time, so thank you very much for your rich contributions, and thank you everyone for such a fascinating set of questions. I'm sure there's many more that we could talk about, but for now that's us. And just to say thanks from the Institute for Ethics in AI and from the Oxford Character Project.
And thanks from us at EFI too.